The prince transformed into a dominating black wolf, only to fall through the hoop and become a prince again, as if the transformation was an illusion. Welcome to the Alpha's Loved channel. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Chapter 9. Alto August. So I love you, because the entire universe conspired to help me find you. The sun stood out. It shone overhead, shedding its afternoon light before the thin rays dissolved into evening sets. The brightness overhead shone over a lone figure in a training yard. The figure had been out since the early morning, to the very hour that is now being spoken of. No sound came out of Prince Alto August's lips as his body hit the ground swiftly, before he pushed himself back up, only to repeat the process several times. With a sudden burst of energy, the prince sprinted to the hoops lying aimlessly around the ring. Still making no noise, no deep breathing or panting sound, the prince, with what looked like ease, leapt gracefully in the air. While suspended, faster than the eye could blink, the body of the prince shuddered and changed into a dominating black wolf. Falling through the hoop, the wolf suddenly became a prince, almost as if the transformation itself had never happened, only an illusion to the eye, perhaps a trick of the sun or the results of scattered thoughts from being outside too long in the heat. The body of the human, however, became that of a beast once more, as the process was repeated over and over, shifting mid-air and going through various sizes and heights of hoops. Galvin watched on in awe of the whole process. No one in the land could perform such a feat. How long must he have practiced to be able to do this? The prince continued his training, paying no mind to Gavin's watchful eyes. He was the only one he would allow to watch, and Gavin knew this and respected it. Galvin felt the sudden urge to train harder. Inspired by his prince, "I am the beta of this kingdom," were his lingering thoughts while he watched the mighty feats performed as if they were mere warm-ups. Full shifting werewolves now in days were rare, and the kingdom was lucky that their prince was so powerful. Most werewolves now could only half shift or take on a few features of the animal. Some could not even shift at all, their only show that they still belonged to such a mythological race being their strong senses. The training it took to become a full shifter was hard and intense, taking years of endless focus and dedication. The process itself was very painful, and most choose not to undergo such training in fear of reliving such agony. Yet here the prince was. No noise of pain, not a whimper of discomfort or even a small intelligible sign to see that he was experiencing any of this. He truly is a monster, was all Gavin could think as he kept his eyes trained on the prince. Gavin knew the prince had noticed him. Though Gavin and the prince went back, the beta still felt a small sense of fear for who the boy he had adored grew up to be. The prince cut short his training and walked quietly over to Gavin. He took the towel that was offered to him, nodding his thanks, and proceeded to wipe the sweat from his eyes. Gavin cleared his throat and said, "The Queen is wondering why you did not make it to your fitting." August looked at Gavin with no expression on his face. Gavin knew he was already angry for having his training interrupted. He could feel the waves of power coming off of him even thicker after the question was asked. Gavin tried his best to not show his discomfort. "I think she wants you there now." August kept his gaze level and nodded. Setting down the towel, he picked up his shirt from the bench where he'd sat that morning. Finished putting it over his head, he nodded again at Gavin. Gavin started walking to the Queen's hallway where she was waiting. He took a deep sigh, knowing August could hear his pounding heart already. Ever since they had come back from the search, there had been a cloud of darkness that Gavin swore up and down he could see, visible trail the prince. Almost like a rain cloud had descended upon the young man. Gavin knew he had given up. It broke both his and his life-mate Crystal's heart to see it after the journey and trek they made across the world for him. He just needed a little sunshine in his life. Gavin smiled, remembering the words his mate had said when he voiced his concern. Yes, a little sunshine indeed would lift that dark cloud. The only problem was, where do you find it? Chapter 10, in which I slip past. Sometimes, I think of the sun and moon as lovers who rarely meet. Always chase, and almost always miss one another. But once in a while, they do catch up. And they kiss, and the world stares in awe of their eclipse. I couldn't understand why this was happening to me. No, more like HOW, this was happening to me. Did these people forget that I'm just an omega? I had tried not to let my rank in the pack put me down before. Tried to keep up my mantra in my head of being brave to be the sun. But there was always this thread of doubt. This knowledge of the darkness that I knew that was inside me that led me to be what I am today, an omega. Most people did not look down on us openly like in the old days. I'd heard stories of those times from the older omegas, saw the scars on their backs from the lashings they had received or the twitches in their eyes that would never go away, caused by the unholy suffering they went through. The king had changed that. Or the omegas told me. Queen Isadora had changed that. It's why I had admired her so much as a child, and even more when I was demoted to an omega. But I couldn't understand that single question that kept running through my head. Why me? Why would Mr. Joseph choose me to be honored? Why would I feel just an easy attachment and love for the new queen? Why was she trying so hard for me, to make the ceremony a magical night? I couldn't understand it. Into my mind, I could be honored all I wanted to be, but I was still just an omega. The sigh that escaped my lips was loud as I walked down the hallways towards my destination, the Queen's hallway. She had asked me to come by and pick up my blue to see a clip, along with the final words of, "I'll need to tell you what time and where to be so we can get you ready tomorrow." A passing butler had pointed out the way to me as I walked to the royal side of the palace, the side where the king, queen, and prince resided, and walked through. Lizzie had squealed with delight when I came from my dream fitting. "Tell me everything," she shouted. So while we peeled potatoes that an angry Lafair had assigned to me, I told her every detail of what had happened. "I can't believe it." She jumped up and down in her stool. "Of course, Jane, I will help while you talk to us." Why gosh, Fade, this is a chance of a lifetime. You could see the prince. I laughed at how single-minded Lizzie was. Always about the prince. "Thank you, Lizzie. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Smiling to her, "I'll try to sneak you and Jane some of the desserts from the table." Lizzie smiled broadly at that and started to laugh excitedly. "Oh my gosh, Fayette. This will be a night you remember forever." I couldn't help but catch some of her excitement. It was infectious. Maybe I was a little excited to go to the ceremony. Maybe it was okay that an omega like me would be there. But away from Lizzie's warm laughter and smile, I quickly felt myself dark into my previous thoughts of why fate should play out this way. My thoughts kept me company until I reached the Queen's hallway. There the door that leads to her study was obvious to see. It was a thick redwood, majestic with gold leaf swirling around in an arch and golden handles to accompany it. Pulling down on the fine material, I opened up to a room of bustling work and an air of nonsense. The Blue Moon ceremony was tomorrow and the Queen was taking it very seriously. I tried to move quickly with the people, so as to not get in the way of anyone as they sprinted by with huge stacks of paperwork. I spotted the Queen in the back near the windows, looking down on a layout of the ballroom. "I think we need more blue trimming in the balcony, and get those doves out." "Who even thought of such a ridiculous thing?" the Queen said to a group of men. They quickly nodded and made notes, then rolled up the paper and left. I waited until the Queen was done signing something, but she had already noticed me. "I'll have to be quick about this, dear. I have important things I still need to do." The Queen sighed loudly and said, "Like get a new suit fitted." I frowned a little at the Queen in confusion. Was she wearing a suit to the ceremony? She turned to me and handed me the Bluetooth clips and other wires of sorts. Here is all you need, dear, though I would suggest that you be the one to do the midnight show and not one of your assistants. I nodded to the Queen. I had already planned on doing that. The midnight show was too big for Lizzie and Jane to handle. The ceremony starts at midday, but only those. The Queen paused at this but held her head back up and said, "It's boring anyway, and you'll be better off not going." I nodded in agreement. The real fun begins at 9. Dinner has already been served and guests will start making their way to the ballroom. "You, my dear," the Queen gave me a firm nod, "will go to the same room where we found your dress earlier today. Once there, my maids will help you get ready. I told them you would be present at 7. "Your hours," I gasped. The Queen gave a small smile. "The price of beauty, but they will wash you first, so that should take you around an hour at most." I stood dumbstruck at the Queen. I had never taken 2 hours of my life to get ready for something. "Don't worry, dear," the Queen said, patting my cheek. "You are beautiful now. I can see it. But when they are done with you, I'm sure I'll have to pry you away from all the men in the room myself." She laughed at the joke she had made and started walking to the door. I followed closely behind her. "Sorry that we can't tonga, dear, but I'm expecting a fitting to come by at any moment." I nodded and smiled at the Queen. "Thank you, Queen Rena. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Bowing slightly, glad that I had asked Lizzie her name before coming up. She smiled with her teeth flashing at me. "Any time, dear," was all she said, before turning around and proceeding to yell at a man who had tripped and spilled papers everywhere. She was definitely not what I had expected, especially with such a cold greeting she first gave to Lizzie and me. Walking out the door, I closed the majestic redwood and studied the golden leaf archway for a second. My head snapped up when I heard voices coming from further down the hall. I quickly started to walk back down the hall. A man's voice came floating to my ears. "Really, August, it won't be that bad, and I'm sure the Queen will be swift with it, you just..." Not wanting to be caught in the middle of the Queen's hallway alone, I raced around the corner before the men could see me, turning out of their sights before they rounded the corner. Chapter 11. Alto August. Sometimes the most courageous act a human can do is to let somebody love them. Michael's Avia. "Really, August, it won't be that bad, and I'm sure the Queen will be swift with it. You just have to hold still, endure it." Galvin watched closely to see if the prince would have any reaction to his words. His face never changed. Galvin sighed as they rounded the corner and entered the Queen's hallway. The majestic redwood doors stood there like they have for every queen. August continued his walk until he was stopped by a hand. Looking down, he saw that Gavin had reached out to prevent him from entering. Gavin gulped back whatever courage he had, embraced it for this moment. He would need it. It's never too late to find your soulmate, August. Something seemed to flash in Prince August's eyes. The most of a reaction Gavin had seen from him in a while. "Do you remember the story of the meeting of mates?" August's body stilled. Gavin could tell that he was uncomfortable with the sudden change in topic, but he knew that this would be the only time he would be able to get the prince away from his obsessive training. He knew that the meeting of mates story was the prince's favorite. It told Gavin a lot of things about the prince. How when he was little, he would keep requesting to hear the story, and Gavin watched as the little prince, A.W.W. Whedon, laughed. It told Gavin that he was a romantic at heart, that he was a true gentleman and had an old soul about him. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. You would have such a personality. He spent 2 unnecessary years looking for a life mate after all." Gavin took a deep breath and said, "When they meet, it's not as two, but their souls connect and form together. So strong is this bond, so deep is it made, that the tears cannot but help flow, because the other half of one's soul has been saved. August made no move and stared with blank eyes at Gavin. Thus it is known, to all those who search the one you love, the soul you need is just a teardrop away from your heart. August took a deep shuddering breath and said, "Stop." Gavin's mouth closed. He couldn't have opened it even if he tried. The power that radiated off the prince was too much to make his inner wolf even think of going against such a powerful aura. August looked down at Gavin and said, "Thank you," before opening the doors and walking inside. Gavin gave a deep breath. He had done the right thing. He knew it. Inside he heard the queen briskly tell the prince to stand while she measured him. No other person would get near him. While she did so, the queen struck up a conversation with the prince, a rare sight that Gavin normally did not see. The queen normally was cold and kept to herself. "I need to ask a favor of you." Looking up at August. August looked back down at her, but made no reply. The queen continued, "Your mother made a tradition of honoring a worker who has done an impressive amount of service for their king and queen." She wiped a stray piece of hair that had fallen in her face. "This year's ceremony, a young girl was chosen. She looks to be about 17 or 18, but I want her to have a good time tomorrow." The prince and Gavin looked at the queen, Gavin being the only one to show his astonishment. The queen never showed affection for anything. In some ways she was very similar to August. Gavin mused. "Can you behave and dance with her tomorrow during the celebration?" The queen looked up at August and quickly added, "Please." August looked at the queen. She had never asked anything of him before, and certainly one dance with another of the thousands of faceless girls he had already seen would do no harm. "Okay," August said, nodding. The whole room stilled into silence. The queen smiled and whispered, "Thank you," before turning around to the workers and yelling, "One word and you suddenly become idiots. Get back to work, people, we have lots to do still." With the fitting done, the queen shooed away both Gavin and August, saying she had other things to do. Gavin followed August to the training grounds and watched as the prince pulled off his shirt, threw it on the bench where he last left it, and proceeded where he left off at in his training. Gavin leaned against a post and sighed. It was almost as if he had never left. Chapter 12, Blue Moon Ceremony. Blue Moon, you saw me standing alone, without a dream in my heart, without a love of my own. Blue Moon, you knew just what I was there for. You heard me saying a prayer for someone I could care for. And then there suddenly appeared before me someone my arms could really hold. I heard you whisper, "Darling, please adore me." And when I looked to the moon, it turned to gold. Blue Moon, a cloud of silence had fallen over the castle. Many eyes glanced at what form of devices they could find that showed time to their wondering eyes. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Joseph looked around the ballroom, nervously making the last walk to check that everything was in place, before taking out his phone. One minute. The kitchen did not stop in their hurried dash as they ran around with the hot fires and heat of the stoves radiating off them. Only one worker took the time to stop and look up at the ticking clock above their heads. One more minute. Fayette, Jane, Lizzie, and Charles set down the plates and silverware for the dining hall, followed by many professional decorators who looked into the small details and adjusted the plates to face a certain way, made sure the forks were correctly placed, that the flowers would not fall onto anyone's spot. Fayette asked Lizzie for the time, only to have Charles look at the watch on his wrist and say, 11:59. One more minute, Fayette said. The seconds ticked by until they dwindled down to the final few, as the handle completed its full rotation around the circle of the clock. There was a moment of silence, and then the bells started to ring. One by one, Each deep sonorous sound echoed across the halls of the palace as each worker took a moment to pause in their movement and lean their heads towards the source of the noise. All took in a deep breath, but only a moment was spared for the 12 o'clock noon bells. Gradually each began to go back to their own work, knowing that the bells signaled only one thing. The blue moon ceremony had begun. The room was beautiful. Covering the walls were stained glass artworks, showing the history of the wolf. The noon sun filtered through it, splashing the seated crowd below in color. No one wore any color. Only a sea of white could be seen out. As the stained glass cast its glow, many lifted their eyes to the source of what painted them, taking in the artwork for a second before bowing their head. They were waiting, heads jerked up when the deep ringing was heard of the bells. It had begun. In the front from the side, to my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Queen and Prince entered and stood above the crowd. Each wore their own royal color as was tradition. On the birth of princes, fathers were expected to choose a color that they thought best suited their sons for their reign. The same tradition applied to princesses and mothers. However, Queen Isadora only bore one male child. The privilege was something that only the king would experience. The king stood before the crowd in a fashioned red suit that bore a striking resemblance to a military coat of the Royal Werewolf Army. Instead of gold lining, though, the color had been replaced with white, the official color of the land that symbolized the moon the werewolves lived by. The queen was embellished in an elegant green dress, the official color of queens, that faded to the bottom in a cloud of white. The prince stood still wearing a formal, yet plain black suit. The only white seen on him was the collared shirt. His attire stood out the most among the white cloud below and the colors beside him. The king stepped past the queen and prince and spoke out to the waiting cloud. Let the blue moon ceremony begin. A rush of excitement filled the air as the mass started to nod and sway. The king held his place in front and lifted his hands upward. The mass knew what he would say, and so, as the king spoke his words, he was accompanied by the many voices all saying the lines that were taught to all from the time they were born. And in the light is the moon, and I see the moon, and she sees me. Let me wane through the years, under her watchful gaze, as forever she is there. Sitting above us still to stay, a hush fell over everyone. No one moved waiting for the king's next words. Bring the fire. A man came from the same unseen side door that the royal family had entered through. In his hands was a bowl that had a flame fixed inside it. Motioned to the man, the king waved his hands towards a table that was in front of him. The man set the flame down and took a seat with the mass below. Everyone has brought their pieces. The king questioned. The seriousness in the air was not broken by the question. Everyone had their pieces. Those who forgot took a quick glance at the prince and gulped back whatever they were going to say about not having it. The king gave another quick look around the room and continued. We bring forth pieces of paper that we will burn. These papers have written on them what you would like to rid from your past. The king smiled and flashed a piece of paper to his people watching. With his demonstration, he placed the slip in the flames, as all watched on in awe of the fire eating what was written, now never to be seen. After the king came the queen, and then the prince. He looked down at his paper. Written on it were only 2 words. Closing his eyes, he tossed the paper into the fire and turned his back to the onlookers. One by one each person came forth and set their paper in the flame. Some cried. Others looked relieved. Some did not look affected at all. It was swiftly done. Only those of high rank and social status were allowed to partake in the blue moon ceremony. Many took honor in such attendance and came, but the crowd still only sized to roughly 200. Most were waiting in their rooms for the real fun that would happen later that night. Once the crowd was seated, The king got up from his chair that was placed in the front to the side. A new burning will take place now. This time we will burn pieces of paper that have written something new that you would like to come forth in your life. The king once again demonstrated to the mass, with the queen and prince following after him. The prince did not even take a second glance at his paper as he threw it away into the flames. The mass came forth again. Some were starting to realize how tedious the ceremony was going to be. Others again, however, were overwhelmed with emotion and throwing their paper into the flames. The king gave a soft sigh of exhaustion of how much was left of the ceremony. Getting back up once everyone was seated, he raised his hands and yelled, "Bring the water." Two men appeared from the side door. One took away the flame and disappeared. The other placed a bowl of water before the king. The king nodded his thanks and turned to the crowd. "Take from you." Servants quickly passed out cups of water to the people. "This water is from the lunar stream," the king said. "Early this morning my son and your queen went to the stream. Together we walked in the stream to prepare ourselves for this ceremony." The people stared in awe at the royal family, then saw the prince and averted their eyes. His presence was a dark wave of fury. All in the room could feel the radiation of power, and some were shocked to locate it coming not from the king but from the sun. The king pushed aside whatever thoughts were traveling through the cloud's head and focused on the ceremony at hand. Putting his hands in the water, he spoke, saying, "Drink the water that is offered and cleanse yourself. Then come forward and dip your hands in the water, for our purpose today is to rid ourselves of the old and celebrate the new." The mass followed their king's instructions, drinking the water, waiting for the queen and prince to wash their hands, and then proceeding up there themselves. A wave of tiredness could already be sensed from some after having to stand up multiple times and wait for the ceremony. The king knew, though, that the final process of the ceremonial part was coming to a close. "Thank you all for coming and celebrating this blue moon." The mass nodded and voiced their welcomes. The king cleared his throat and said, "We lastly must remember our place. We must remember the wolf." The mass nodded again. The king stepped aside and the queen took his place where he stood. She spoke in a clear, strong voice, telling the story of the wolf to the people. Old, long ago, when humans still had access to the land and freely roamed, a village was walking through the forest. The people were moving to a better land. While in the forest, though, a wolf walked past the people. The wolf paid no mind to the people, ignoring them, and the people respected the power of the wolf. One girl, however, said to herself, "If only I could have a husband like that. Graceful and powerful, yet so deadly and beautiful." Later that night, when the village was sleeping, the wolf came to the girl, for he had read her heart and what she was thinking. He turned into a man and woke the girl, telling her to come with him. The girl left her family and went with the wolf. The wolf and girl had 2 sons. As the sons grew, however, they began to notice how different they were from their father. For he was a full wolf, who was able to take the shape of man, while the sons were full man, only able to take of a wolf. The girl, now woman, told her wolf husband that their sons wished to experience human life. Reluctant at first, the wolf eventually gave in and let her go. The woman's father had been mourning the loss of his daughter for so long. When in the middle of the night she suddenly appeared, he was overjoyed. She showed him how different she and her sons were, that explained to him all that had happened. Her father, wanting the woman back, said to her that he accepted both her and the wolf. And so the tribe prospered greatly because of the father's great sense in respecting the wolf. The tribe grew bigger and the wolf eventually overtook the men and women of the pack, until the term werewolf was born and created. Thus, the queen concluded, is the story of the wolf. The mass exhaled, knowing the queen had given out the short version of the story. The king looked openly mad at the queen for out details, but wiped away his anger by forcing a smile and saying, "Let us remember the wolf." The prince stepped up and a few gasps were heard. This was his one part in the ceremony that the king had greatly debated on giving to him. Looking at the quivering mass, the prince spoke in a normal level voice that seemed to somehow be heard by all, saying, "Let us now eat." Several people in the front row fell off their seats, having fainted on the spot. Chapter 13, in which I see him, I clipped the Bluetooth onto my ear. "Lizzie," I said hesitantly at first, "can you hear me? Loudeclia." Lizzie shouted from the other end. I winced at the high volume. I could hear Jane in the background. "Lizzie, you don't have to shout. She can hear you." "I can hear you." Lindsayism. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylen Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Confirming what Jane said. HEDOVAFLOW I repeat, has the dove flown? Lizzie, you don't have to shout. I yelled at her. Some people jumped away from me and cast a worried glance at the girl who was talking to the eye sculpture, before walking quickly away. SORYMNOTUSETOTHIS. Lizzie shouted. I gave a soft groan. Would I be able to hear by the end of this night? BYTHEWAYGIRLYOULOKBEAUTIL. Lizzie shouted. Thank you, Lizzie, I said in a normal voice, trying to emphasize that it was a good idea to talk in the same tone. ILOVEETTISS. ITSBETANWHATYOUDSCRIBED. Lizzie shouted back. I took the earpiece out of my ear and rubbed my forehead. This wasn't going to work. I had muffled noises coming from the device and reluctantly put it back on. Sorry, Fayette, this is Jane. I gave a sigh of relief in my head. What happened to Lizzie? Deciding to be polite. She said you were too loud and it was getting her a headache. Jane replied. The wing to one of the ice sculptures snapped off. I looked down in surprise to find the melting piece in my hand. Looking around cautiously to make sure no one saw it, I put the broken piece on the back of the swan and walked slowly away. I saw that, Jane noted. No, you didn't. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylen Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I walked around the ballroom. People were mingling, the clock almost about to hit 9. The Queen's maids who had helped me with my dress, hair, and makeup had gushed over every detail, from my waist to my hair, to my eyes and finally down to my toes. They were nice ladies, but the endless praise had made me uncomfortable. The process, though, had been life-changing. Never had I had someone brush my hair the way they did, or help me with makeup. Never had I had someone gush over me as those women did. I never had that someone who hugged me wishing me good luck, as if I was leaving for something as simple as a high school dance. Don't cry now, Fayette. One of the maids, Mays, had said to me. I hiccuped with the effort of holding in my sobs. You don't want to ruin the makeup now, do you, love? Honey said. Oh hush, honey. Trish. Another maid spoke up. It's waterproof, so let her cry her eyes out. I would be crying too if I was pretty as her and got to go. I sniffed and smiled at them. Want to look in the mirror now? Honey asked. Excitement on her face. I nodded. They had shaved me in places that I didn't even understand. It's not like anyone would be seeing my legs. And had curled my blonde hair, leaving it, as May said, long, hanging and beautiful, only adding a few pins here and there to keep some parts in place. The makeup had been minimal. Each maid agreed on that. Just enough to bring out those pretty blue eyes, Trish said. After all that prodding and primping, I hoped I would see a change in the mirror. But I never expected what I saw. The girl standing in front of me looked like she was gliding. She looked confident. She looked happy. I stared at the face that looked back at me. It was me. I could see it, just enhanced in a way that I never thought possible. But the dress. Oh, the dress. It was the right choice. You're radiating, Honey said softly, as we all took in my figure. I turned to the maids and kissed and hugged everyone. Thank you, I whispered. Walking now in the ballroom, I felt like I was radiating. I had never experienced such a feeling before of dressing up. It was like I was a new person, like I had taken a mask and pulled it over my face, hiding the broken parts and replacing it with this beautiful new girl. Then the clock struck 9. A cheer went up from the bystanders. They were tired of waiting. Soon the people began to flood in at an overwhelming rate. I waited and watched. Then it was time. Jane. Right here. I could hear Lizzie yelling in the background that she was there too. Cue the lights. The effect was immediate. People gave gasps of amazement as the ceiling became a picture of a moving night sky. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Queen and Prince, who had entered upon a balcony, looked up at the work. Amazing, the king whispered, looking at the ceiling that had somehow become a duplicate of the sky outside. The queen gave a small smile. The king noticed and turned to her. Why are you smiling? He asked warily. This is only the beginning of her work, the queen said, almost in the tone of a proud mother. The king picked up on it but decided not to pursue his curiosity. He glanced at his son, who still had his head tipped back gazing at the sky above. What do you think? He asked the prince. The prince didn't move, and for a second the king worried that he had not been heard, but slowly the prince's head lowered down until he was looking into his father's eyes. The king repressed a shudder that threatened to sneak down his spine. He refused to break eye contact, but the process was very painful. The prince raised his head slowly back to the created sky and said, "Glorious." As the prince looked up at the sky, the queen stepped forward. A soft light was turned onto the balcony. The queen smiled and said, "This is the time to get rid of the old and celebrate the new." There was a rounding cheer from the crowd below. Welcome to the Blue Moon ceremony. Music, please, the queen shouted. Music started, softly at first, and soon couples were forming around the room. Others were choosing to forgo the traditional to and instead take a group into the crowd, dancing away together. The queen turned to the prince and took his arm. You promised me a dance, she said to him. The prince nodded. At the moment he didn't feel like dancing. Anyone looking at him could tell. As the queen dragged the prince away, the king watched with pitying eyes for whatever girl had to dance with his son. The moment the queen and prince stepped foot on equal ground with the crowd, however, people began to swarm. Some had consumed drinks well before the hour of 9, and in their haze, became more bold with the prince's dark aura. "Oh, yes, thank you for coming," the queen said, smiling at the people. "Please go and enjoy yourselves. We were just about to dance also." The crowd began to thin out, but the queen and prince still had to politely shove their way through. "I think you like this girl, August," the queen said. The prince replied only by radiating more power off of his frame. He was not happy. "Well, you can at least be friends with her," the queen sighed. Still, no response was made. "If she faints, please have the decency to carry her to the side," the queen mumbled. At that, the prince broke character and gave one laugh. The queen smiled and laughed. They surfed through the crowd. Many had changed from their white attires into something with more color, though no female had dared to wear green. The queen swirled her head this way and that, looking for the pretty girl in yellow. Suddenly the lights dimmed even more and the ceiling exploded with color. The music and explosions of different novas and stars in the sky collided together at the same time. creating a music show for the onlookers. Keeping in time with the music, the beautiful display of colors left everyone breathless, looking up in awe and wonder. The Queen and Prince stopped to stare, too enraptured with the display to do anything else. "She is amazing," the Queen gasped. The Prince stared wordlessly up. Suddenly the Queen felt a small poke on her shoulder. She turned around to see the girl whom she had been so desperately looking for. "Fayette, dear," she breathed, surprising Fayette by giving her a hug. Fayette shyly returned the hug. "Do you like it?" Faye asked the Queen. "Fayette, dear, it's beautiful. I can't believe you did this." Suddenly remembering the reason as to why she was looking for the girl in the first place, the Queen smiled and took her arm. "Fayette, this is Prince Alto August." Fayette stared at the tall dark back that was facing her. Black hair that was swept in a style was leaned back, as the person the Queen indicated, as the Prince had his face raised to the light show above. The Queen took the Prince's shoulder in her hand and squeezed it. A sigh could be seen given from the back of the tall dark person. Slowly the figure turned around, reluctant as if he did not want to let his eyes leave the show that was above him. Facing the Queen and Fayette, he looked down and froze. The Queen stared with wide eyes as she witnessed a sight she had never seen before. Tears were streaming down the Prince's face. The Queen turned to say something to Fayette when she jolted away and let go of the girl. Tears were streaming down Fayette's face. Fayette looked in confusion and wiped her hands on her cheek, looking in disbelief at the liquid that was pouring down. Gasping, the Queen turned and walked swiftly away. She needed to find Gavin. She left Fayette and the Prince alone to stare at each other. Neither one noticed her departure. When looking back, Fayette could never tell exactly what had happened in that moment. Her heart did not pound, nor did her hands shake or knees go weak as Lizzie always described it. She felt calm, no anxiety, no agitation. The Prince took a step closer to Fayette. As the party whirled on, no one noticed the change in history that was being made in that moment. Slowly, he took Fayette's hand in his. The Prince raised it to his lips and softly kissed it, closing his eyes. When he opened them, it was as if something clicked inside. Still holding her hand, he took another step closer and whispered softly to her, "There you are. I've been looking for you. Chapter 14, in which we dance had you been there tonight, you might know how it feels to be struck to the bone in a moment of breathless delight, less miserable. All my life my heart is sort of thing I cannot name, a piece that suddenly clicked into place. I had always rolled my eyes when Lizzie talked about love at first sight. I didn't believe it. Even now, looking into his eyes, I still don't believe it, but I believe in that click." As he took a step closer to me, and then another. As he reached out for my hand and I gave it to him, as he kissed it slowly, letting flesh touch flesh for the first time, as he closed his eyes, then opened them to reveal his gaze. As he spoke, "There you are. I've been looking for you." I felt that click. I wasn't searching for another half because I'm not half. I'm a whole person. But I knew in that moment that he had all of me. I let out a deep sigh. We still were staring into each other's eyes. Then my haze cleared up and my mind started to pound. Wait, am I the Prince's life mate? I started to let out a choking noise and took a step back. The moment broke. The Prince took a few steps toward me and claimed both of my hands. His eyes held a deep, desperate sorrow that had me staring in wonder. I never knew a man could look that way. Not tonight. My eyes widened a little with. In the moment I had not noted it. But now I realized that his sound was deeper than the average man. "Don't think about it tonight," he continued, burning me with his stare. I looked at the Prince. He kept my gaze, staring into me. I couldn't tell what was going through his face at the moment. I didn't know what he was thinking. Please, he choked out. I wanted to be with him. It was strange. I didn't want to run away. I didn't even feel scared about the fact that I was his life mate. He was I wanted to stay with him. My head cleared enough after those thoughts for me to register screaming in my ears. Fayettete, ETTE, ACHEPHEPRINCLIKSYOU, HELOVHELOVESYOU. Lizzie screamed. I could even hear calm collected Jane in the background hyperventilating saying over and over, "What just happened? What just happened?" DANCFAYETT. Lizzie screamed at me. I winced at the noise that I now could register. I looked up at the prince only to see a ghost of a smile on his face. Holding out his elbow for me, he motioned his head toward the crowd that was moving. I knew he could hear Lizzie and Jane. They were so loud. Without hesitation, I took his elbow. I felt calm around him. Maybe it was the fact that I knew we were life mates, or maybe it was a wolf thing. But his presence, how big he was, and the power that he exerted, all made me feel safe. Leading into the middle of the crowd, the prince took my hand and started to grab my waist. When suddenly the slow music changed, I looked up in horror when I heard the first few notes of the song that only two girls knew I loved to dance to. In the earpiece, I heard Lizzie laugh like a mad woman. Lizzie's EY. Casting frantic looks to the prince who now stood somewhat awkwardly, not knowing what had just happened. DNCEGIRL. She screamed. BREKTHESTO and EPRNC. I gritted my teeth and turned to apologize to the prince when suddenly he grabbed my hand. Looking down there up at him, I saw him smiling widely at me. I think my heart stopped. Just as suddenly he swung me out then back in, and twirled me in a circle. I couldn't help the laughter that escaped my mouth as we took up with the music, and created our own wild dance. The music infected us, the song upbeat, making you want to move along with it. Our wild dancing soon had a circle formed around us as people moved to avoid us spinning out of control. I was laughing hard and he was giving me soft laughs and a small smile. Midway through the song, lights flashed above and rained down on the crowd in an explosion of color. My senses were overwhelmed. We spun to the music and danced in our own crazy way. People were watching, encompassing us in a circle of bodies. Disbelief in their eyes that the stone prince could laugh and wonder at who the girl he was laughing with was. All who watched though couldn't help the smile that came across their face. The couple's attitude was infectious and made many others get up and dance wildly. The prince and Fayette noticed none of it though. The only thing on their minds were the touch of their hands, the sounds of their laughter as it mingled with the music, and the lights that flashed above to their unrestrained dance. "Look at them, Jane," Lizzie said, tears streaming down her face. She looked to see if Jane heard her only to find the girl racking insults. "Jane, what's wrong?" Lizzie asked. Jane lifted her tear-stained face and said, "This is so beautiful I can't handle it," and then went back to crying. Lizzie smiled and rubbed Jane's back in comfort. She looked down at the stumbling, laughing couple. "You go, girl," she whispered, smiling. The queen had to stop and stare at the sight she saw below her. That could not be the prince. There was no way. Her mind was in a panic. Why Fayette? Why of all people? Why her? She pleaded in her head. She needed to look away from the radiant dancing couple. Even though the scene brought a smile to her face, knowing what she knew quickly made it disappear. Have to find Gavin, but there was no need. Like before in her search for Fayette, the object of her pursuit found her first. Gavin, with his life-mate Crystal on his arm, walked up to the queen's side and the three watched in disbelief the dark man who was twirling the laughing sun. "Is that?" Crystal started, but she couldn't finish. It would have been too good to be true. Gavin turned to the queen with wonder in his eyes. "Is she the one?" The Queen nodded to the two. Crystal turned to Gavin and the two cheered and laughed together. Gavin in his excitement picked Crystal up and twirled her around, kissing her cheek before setting her down. Yes, he yelled. Crystal clapped her hands in excitement and joy. This is amazing. Look at him. He doesn't look like our prince at all. The Queen had to smile at that. The laughing figure below her looked nothing like the prince. He looked like a blind man who had seen the sun for the first time. He looked amazed. This won't last long, the Queen whispered. Crystal gave a curious look at the Queen, but Gavin nodded. He and the Queen, thinking the same thoughts, both turned their heads at the same time to look at the same person. The King, still standing on the balcony from which he first came in, staring now at his son. The look in his eyes made it seem like the world was burning, and he was the one holding the torch. Chapter 15, in which we talk if I am worth anything later, I am worth something now. For wheat is wheat, even if people think it is grass in the beginning. Vincent van Gogh. I can't really remember what happened. Almost as if I was in a drunken stupor without a drop of wine having reached my lips. The haze that clouded me after he touched my hand descended so rapidly that I could hardly think of what to do, what to say. I tried to shove off the thick cloud that intoxicated me, but to no avail. I stayed in my sober, drunken state. It might have been the music, maybe the lights. The thrill of it all or the whirling events that were coming into my mind. But every time I look back, I can't see clearly what happened in those minutes. I can only see flashes, a pounding heart, a touch of the hand, strokes of light dancing above. Muffled music, his scent, his hands in. When the spell that was cast finally came over me, I was in a garden, outside of the palace. Away from the noise, dancing, and music, we were sitting on a bench. The night sky was above us, and the garden grounds were bare. Only the trickle of a fountain, hidden behind a hedge, could be heard. I turned to him and started to chant in my head to remember to breathe. Breath Fayette. The prince was staring off into the direction of where the noise of the fountain was. His eyes darted toward me, then quickly went back to their aimless stare. I started when I realized that this whole time I had done nothing but stare at him. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilgan, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I shifted in my seat. It wasn't awkward per se. I just didn't know what to say to him. You look faint. Thank you, I mumbled. I connected the dots that me looking faint was the reason why we were out here. I didn't hum. The prince suddenly looked agitated, his hands twitching a little before he shoved them in his pockets. He took a deep breath and suddenly was composed. I wish I had that level of self-discipline. I don't know your name. A silence stuck between us before a giggle escaped my mouth. I tried to suppress my laughter, but that only resulted in a snort coming out. I widened my eyes in horror and looked at him, but he laughed softly too. That was cute, he whispered. I blushed deeply. Oh, what's going on? I don't know your name either, I admitted, reflecting on the reason why I snorted in the first place. The prince stared at me for a second before suddenly a booming laugh escaped his lips. He bent over, clinking to his side. I jumped startled at the noise. I don't think I've ever heard him laugh fully yet. He laughed and hit his calf hard, before sitting up and looking at me. You don't know me? He asked, smiling. I know you're the prince. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Not wanting him to think me stupid. I've never met anyone who didn't know me, he whispered. The silly air just as quickly as it became one full of laughter, sobered up into something more serious. I've never met anyone who didn't know about me, he continued, who didn't fear me. I gave him a confusing look. I know they call you the Stone Prince. He smiled at Dimitri. Yes, not very creative, are they? You don't seem like it, though. I questioned. His face turned dark. My eyes widened at the sudden transformation. I am like it, though, he whispered. I am emotional, sis. At least I thought I was. He gave me a questioning look. I don't know how women could change that so quickly, though. I stared at him breathlessly. I could tell he was struggling with words. I know, I whispered. He looked at me and smiled. We knew. It wasn't love, really. That I guess would come after. You couldn't love someone instantly, but there was something. Something that drew me to him. Something that made me feel safe yet at the same time alive when I was around him. I felt like I had never felt before. I couldn't describe it, though. Like all the bad dreams suddenly didn't seem scary now, because I had someone to fight them with me. He leaned close to me. My eyes widened. He's not. But he didn't. He pulled me into a hug. A crushing hug. I grunted at the sudden pressure. I've been looking, it seems like forever, but you're all I ever wanted love to be. I laughed silently at him. Who knew the prince could say such romantic words? I whispered while still in his chest. I'm Fayette. He exhaled. I'm Alto August. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I like that. August is usually what they call me by. I like Alto. I mumbled. He tightened his hold on me. That it is your name for you to use alone. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I whispered. Fayette. He whispered back. What happens now? He pulled back and tightened his forehead. I marry you. He looked straight into my eyes when he said it. Whoa-hoo-hoo-hoo, I said, scooting back a few. You can't marry a person you've just met. Alto looked down at me in confusion. But you're my life mate. How about we get to know each other first? Have a few arguments. See what we both like and get to just understand each other. I smiled, trying to show him it was a good idea. You will be my princess. Pushing a stray piece of hair from my face. The haze from my mind cleared up even more. Princess. I can't be a princess. I gasped. Alto's dark face became, if possible, even darker. Yes, you can. My mind whirled. Should I tell him? Should I tell him what I am? Will he accept me? I looked down at my flowing dress, my cleaned hands that had been buffed and smoothed over from my years of work in one day. I looked at my arms, the little scars that covered them. I'm not a princess. I'm a nigger. I slowly got up from the bench. Alto mimicked my movements, eyeing me. Don't. I won't. Don't leave, he whispered. I've been searching for years. My whole life. Don't go now that I've found you. I shook my head. You would have wished you didn't find me. No, Alto said, his voice taking on a level of power that I had never heard used on me. I repressed a shudder. This was the voice of a man who had too much strength and no idea where to put it. Alto, please, I said, begging now, slowly backing away with him stalking me. His voice broke. I bent down and took my shoe off. He stared at me in confusion. Without warning, I threw it at him. He could have caught me. I knew at the moment he grabbed the shoe in the air faster than I could see before I had even turned. But he let me go. I ran away. I distanced myself to save myself, and the broken prince stared. They always said to follow your heart. But if your heart is in a million pieces, which part do you follow? Chapter 16. The suffering of Alto soulmates aren't the ones who make you the happiest. No. They're instead the ones who make you feel the most. burning edges and scars and stars. Old pains and pangs, captivation and beauty, strain and shadows and yearning. Sweetness and dreamlike surrender, they hurl you into the abyss. They taste like hope. Victoria Erickson, it was trickling down now. Most had gone home. The alphas who had decided to come were all swiftly departing back to their respective packs. They each bowed to the king and queen before setting off into the night. Some chose to wait until the morning. The rounding acknowledged fact, though, was that the Blue Moon ceremony was over. The queen felt a buzzing in her head from a headache she knew was coming. The king looked no better. They stood stiffly side by side as they waited by the door for more guests to depart. They felt him before they saw him, dark, menacing. Faint gasps could be heard from around as he passed by people. He kept his head high and his eyes blank as usual. The only sign that anything was wrong was the power surging from him. A power that felt like it would choke all who dared cross him. The prince. The people still straggling behind quickly stepped aside, looking up in amazement at the 180 he had gone through since last seeing the happy smiling man. The queen looked up at the prince with worry flashing in her eyes before she was able to check her emotions and draw up her own blank face. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. However, was not as skilled in the art. Anger showed, hot and red on his features. What are you doing? He hissed at his son, as soon as he stepped up to the queen and king. You think it's grand scary those who look at you into submission. The king looked ready to burst. The prince, however, remained collected. He turned to the queen and took her elbow. She couldn't help the shudder that spread through her. His touch sent jolts through her as the power left her weak into submission. The prince quickly dropped his hand from her and took a step back. Where's Gavin? Was all he said. The queen's eyes widened. For the first time in the prince's presences, she understood why people shook with fear. She understood why they avoided his gaze and why they fainted at his look. She couldn't speak. Something inside her seemed to shrivel up with fear. Her mind made the prince seem like he had grown taller, broader and darker. He was power. Power that left the one caught in the trap we can void. He sucked them into his darkness. And so like him darkness they became. The prince looked at the silent woman with sad eyes, then looked at the man who stood there in angry silence. He walked away. Going up to his room, the prince shook with some unknown emotion. He quickly turned and ran down the halls. He didn't need to go to his room. He needed the training grounds. He needed to run. To let go of this monster that was crawling away inside of him. Gavin was there already, though. Still in his dark blue suit that almost looked black in the light. He was waiting. He knew. One look at the prince and Gavin went forward and swept him into his arms. The prince's body was shaking all over. Gavin and he remained motionless, standing in the embrace while the prince calmed down. Finally, he pulled away, and Gavin led him to a bench beside the training ground. He looked wordlessly up at the prince and patted his leg. You can say it, he whispered. I found her, the prince choked. Gavin closed his eyes and nodded, waiting for the rest. And she ran away. Gavin's heart clenched. It twisted in agony. What would he have done if Crystal ran away from him when they first met? He would have cried if he was being honest, but he wouldn't have let her go. You let her go, Gavin whispered, voicing his thoughts. The prince was back in control of his emotions, his stare once again blank. She would not have wanted me, he whispered. August, Gavin hissed but was surprised when the prince cut him off, standing in front of him. The prince did not like talking, did not like expression any emotion to anyone. Gavin knew in the world the prince lived in, showing your emotions would make you weak. But the prince spoke voluntarily, I keep so much inside me. I grasp my anger, my loneliness, and hold it in my chest. It has changed me into something I never meant to be. It has transformed me into a person I do not recognize. Gavin. The prince paused and looked at Gavin with such suffering in his eyes. But I don't know how to let it go. Gavin's eyes suddenly opened. With the prince's words, he saw him in a new light. In the light that the prince should have been seen in, but no one noticed. The silent, suffering man. She ran away. The prince closed his anguished eyes. Eventually, in the end, they all run away. Chapter 17, in which I drown. You spent so long wondering and asking, how can anyone love me? And you counted your flaws, but didn't have any fingers left for strengths. And when someone finally said they loved you, all you could ask was why, instead of telling them that you loved them too. The sound of water pounding on flesh could be heard from the next room. Lizzie and Jane sat quietly together, for once the pair silent and lost in thought. The silence was broken, however, by Jane's quick movement up from the bed. We need to help her, Jane said. Lizzie blinked her eyes odishly at her, trying to regain focus on reality. She had been so lost in thoughts of the past. How? Lizzie whispered. She seemed to have curled up into herself, with eyes that were far away from the problem at hand. Jane knew what she was thinking of, and quickly gave Lizzie's shoulder a shake. We are focusing on Fayette right now, Lizzie. Lizzie nodded and her eyes cleared up. Whatever train of thought she was traveling quickly abandoned her. She got up from the coach and followed Jane to the bathroom door. It's my fault, Lizzie whispered, as both girls leaned their heads in to hear better what was going on. I told her to dance, to have fun, and now this happened. Jane shuffled closer to Lizzie and rubbed their shoulders together. Faye is in charge of the choices she chooses to make. Both girls looked into each other's eyes and gave a small nod. Slowly, Lizzie opened the door. Steam clouded up the small room, making it thick and moist. Lizzie left the door open as she and Jane traveled to the shower. Drawing back the curtain, they saw a girl huddled in the middle, sitting down with her legs drawn up to her chest, as water beaded onto her back. She had been in there for almost an hour now. They had put her there after the ceremony, not knowing what else to do. Fayette. Lizzie had screamed. Jane and her watched with eyes full of excitement. Fayette, however, looked flustered and dazed after having run up the flights of stairs to reach the booth that controlled the lighting and music. I ran. Fayette fell to the ground and put her hands on her face. Lizzie and Jane were immediately on her. Fayette, are you okay? Fayette. Fayette was shaking all over. Something was coming over her. She didn't know what she had just done. Then her words clicked in their heads. Youdawhat. Lizzie screamed. Jane quickly shushed her and flashed her eyes at the callous remark. Fayette. What's wrong? Tell us, please. Jane pleaded. They both looked with worried eyes at their friend. Fayette was taking short, shallow breaths. Something felt stuck in her throat. Like she wanted to cry and throw up at the same time. Her chest hurt. And her heart wouldn't stop its stuttering pound rhythm. And his name, ringing over and over within her head. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I met him, Fayette said, The girls waited knowing she would say more, and then I ran away. They both closed their eyes at the same time, while Izzy whispered out in a voice full of pain. You found your life mate. You found what so many people are looking for, Fayette. And you ran away from it. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Fayette tried to grasp her feelings and reasons. He wanted me to be a princess. Either way he looked at me, I don't think. I couldn't. No one has ever. A single tear made its way down face. Lizzie and Jane watched it run down, not moving to stop it. I can't be what he sees, was all she whispered, before closing her eyes and hanging her head. Lizzie and Jane said nothing. They had to get back to the light show and complete their job. All the while Fate sank into her own darkness further and further. The ceremony finally came to an end, and the king and queen moved from their balcony to the door to wish people well as they left. Jane and Lizzie grabbed Fayette as fast as they could and moved her to their shared bedrooms they had been occupying in their stay at the castle. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Jane said. Lizzie raced ahead to turn the water on. The girls helped Fayette get out of her dress. They sat her down and wiped the makeup off her face and quietly took the pins out of her hair. Fayette looked in the mirror and a sob escaped her mouth. Lizzie and Jane looked down in alarm at her. You would never have wanted me. Lizzie gave an impatient groan and stood in front of Fayette. What are you talking about? Lizzie, Jane said in a warning voice. No, Jane, I'm tired of this, Lizzie said. She turned to Fayette and made sure she was looking into her eyes. Fayette, embrace the glorious mess that you are, girl. Fayette's eyes scrunched a little at Lizzie's words. Lizzie bent down and put both her hands on Fayette's knees. You are the son, she whispered, bossing each word out. Fayette gasped. She had forgotten. How had she forgotten? Every day of every second she said it to her soul. She stood up, making Lizzie and Jane slowly back away to the door. Fayette turned to the girls and smiled the smallest of smiles. Thank you. Then she stepped into the water and round underneath the torrent of scalding rain. As the girls now watched the huddled figure sitting there, they saw the red skin from the heat, the scars that scattered the body, how skinny Fayette was, her wet hair that was thrown around her shoulder. They saw someone who had been broken and glued back together. As her walls went up and her confidence went down, Fayette, Lizzie whispered. Fayette raised her head. Too many thoughts are swirling in my head right now. The girls helped her get out of the shower, helped her dry off and dress in fluffy PJs. Then they set her down on the bed. What was it like? Jane asked Fayette, as all three girls sat together. It was terrifying and amazing, Fayette whispered. If it's both terrifying and amazing, then you should definitely pursue it, Lizzie said. Fayette looked at her two best friends, her sisters. They had done so much for her tonight. Can I? In that moment, Fayette sounded like she had gone back to being nothing more than a small child. Uncertain and questioning, yet at the same time, a small part of her wanting. She looked at Lizzie and Jane and they both smiled and nodded to her. Make the choice, you can live with Fayette, Jane said, patting her hand. Fayette exhaled. Will he even want me after I ran away like that? If he doesn't, I'll kick his. Lizzie, Jane cut in. Lizzie gave a sheepish grin and smiled to Fayette. The best girl is the one worth waiting for, right? I'm not sure that's true, Jane said with a sigh. Well, then the best girl is the one worth fighting for, Lizzie argued. Again Lizzie, not really helpful, Jane mumbled, before turning to a smiling Fayette. Her friend's bickering had lifted her mood. You won't know until you try, girl, Lizzie said. Zhang smiled and nodded. We have your back. You just have to be brave enough. You just have to be brave enough. And if he doesn't accept you for what you are, then he doesn't need you for who you are, which is an amazing, beautiful woman, James said. Hear? Lizzie yelled. All three of them laughed. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm, Jane said, handing Fayette a phone. Go ahead. Fayette took the phone and scrolled until she found the number she needed. Letting it ring. The phone finally connected, and the familiar sound filled her ear as the voice of Alpha Bruno was heard on the other end. Alpha Bruno speaking. Fayette let out a rush of pent-up air. Alpha Bruno, she whispered. There was silence on the other end of the phone, and a shuffling noise was heard before Alpha Bruno said sharply, Fayette. Is that you? Are you okay? I'm fine, Alpha Bruno. Something unexpected came up. I'm sorry to ask this, Alpha. Anything, Fayette? Ask me anything, Alpha Bruno whispered. Can you please come? I'm going to need your help with something. Help? Alpha Bruno asked. Fayette released another breath of pent-up air and explained to Alpha Bruno the whirlwind of the events that led to that moment. There was a short pause. I'm on my way. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode of the story, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications for updates.